This is the Futures Forum podcast, a production of the Center for Racial Justice and Equitable Futures at Cornell University. Find us online at equitablefutures.cornell.edu.
Hello, listeners. I'm Jamila Michener, Director of the Center for Racial Justice and Equitable Futures and Professor of Government and Public Policy at Cornell University.
And I'm Neil Lewis Jr., Associate Director of the Center and Associate Professor of Communication and Public Policy at Cornell.
Welcome back to the Futures Forum. As you know, if you've been listening, and in case you haven't, just to make sure you know, the Futures Forum is a multimodal space for collectively dreaming, imagining, and co-creating ideas. Today, we have Jennifer Chudy on the podcast to talk with us about the politics and implications of racial sympathy. What is that, you may ask? We're going to learn all about it, and there's a lot to learn and a lot to talk about. So we're really excited to have Jennifer on the show today. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here with you.
Okay, well, let's jump in. I want to start where we normally start, which is really just some context for our listeners so they have some sense of what to expect from our conversation today. So Dr. Jennifer Chudy is an associate professor of political science at Wellesley College. Selfishly, perhaps, I'm actually really excited to geek out with a fellow political scientist. And Dr. Chudy studies white Americans' racial attitudes with a focus on the roots and reasons for those attitudes and their consequences for American politics. She is author of a book called Some White Folks, The Interracial Politics of Sympathy, Suffering, and Solidarity. I love the title, and we're going to get into the book. So if you're like, wait a minute, what's that about? Don't worry, we'll get there. It's a super interesting and important book, and I know that you all are going to learn from the insights that it offers and that we get to in the conversation to follow. We're going to dig in with Jen today, and we'll talk about the terrain covered in the book, and we'll really think about why the politics of sympathy matters, what it means for the prospects and possibilities of racial justice, and what the limits of racial sympathy are, especially in the context of problems that require what I would say is structural transformation. So that's where we're going, and I'm really excited to have you all on the ride along with us.
Jen, it's so great to have you here. So for our listeners, to give you a bit of background and context, Jen and I have been friends since graduate school. We were actually housemates back in Michigan when she was doing her PhD in political science and I was doing my PhD in social psychology. We lived in the house where lots of social science PhD students would often come together for a variety of festivities. So maybe we'll get into some of that.
Please.
But
All the dirt.
Yeah, so, we had some good times when we weren't toiling away in the Institute for Social Research. And so we'll get into some of that. But to get us started, on the podcast, we now have this tradition of asking our guests to sort of take us beyond the official bios, beyond what Jamila just read. And so can you tell us a bit about what brought you to this work that you do? What has your journey been, and what motivates you to continue doing this work?
Yeah, thank you so much. So for this project really reflects kind of two parts of my journey. One that was the place and time in which the book was conceived, but then another part is kind of more longstanding themes in my own life. So the place and time, as Neil has alluded to, well, the place was this yellow house in Ann Arbor. And for additional details, you have to subscribe to the Patreon for that. So it was this place where it was a lot of political scientists and social psychologists actually living together. There's a deep reverence for social psych in my work. At the time, not to date you, Neil, but I'll just say that it was in and around, I started grad school at the first Obama administration. And then because grad school takes so long, it obviously continued into the second. And so like many political scientists, I was fascinated by Barack Obama. And there were many political scientists at Michigan doing excellent work on his election, and so many components to that to explore. But one that was really interesting to me was, who were these white people who were so enamored by him, who were so fascinated by him, so enthusiastic about him? In my own life, I had seen these white people, when I went to college, go really, really part in volunteering for him and supporting him. And then after college, when I moved on to become a young professional, I saw this again, and it was just really perplexing to me. So Obama himself had kind of talked about this. He talked about the coalition that elected him, and he had said, there are many Black people who will support me, and they will do so out of sense of solidarity, symbolism. And he said, there's also many white people who will oppose me because I'm the first Black president. But he said, there's also some white folks, which is where the title of the book comes from, that really like me because I'm a Black candidate. And that was so curious to me. So that was the place and time. But I think one of the reasons it was so curious to me is my own background as a mixed race person. I am constantly thinking about what racial groups think about each other. It's kind of part of my day-to-day experience growing up, and part of navigating the world between categories is, for me, has meant as someone who's constantly thinking about racial identity and when interracial relations work, when they don't work. That's kind of a North Star for me, even as I think about other projects. And so I think the culmination of those things kind of led me to pursue this. And Obama offered a way to pursue this in a very tangible way because he was a politician a lot of people knew about and were writing scholarship about. So I think the book reflects kind of those two streams.
Yeah. It's interesting for a number of reasons. And, one of them, which won't surprise you, given some of our conversations over the years, that I'm interested in is who sort of notices those dynamics early on, right? So even going back to that quote from Obama, where it's like, well, I know some groups are going to like me for this reason, some are going to hate me for this, but there's this third group that might like me for this other reason. So being able to perceive those coalitions is something that we've thought about a lot and talked about on this show. So last month, we had Dorian Warren here talking about mobilizing versus organizing, which is, of course, another thing that Obama is known for. But trying to figure out where different people are in the population, who can you leverage for these kinds of efforts is just something that's fascinating. And I know that your book gets into a bit.
Yeah, and I love the connection to your own self, right? And this is a theme that we've been pulling through all our conversations. And we joked with a sociologist, Victor Ray, when he was on the podcast a while back about how we're all doing me search, right? Yeah. And that me search can sometimes in kind of standard social science or research settings have a negative connotation as though it implies some kind of bias. But the reality is that what it means is that our experience of the world, what we see when we look out in the world, it can generate interesting questions that matter. And these are questions that other people won't necessarily ever have unless they have those experiences. So because you're somebody who, given your own background, is constantly thinking about and grappling with the consequences of and the contours of interracial relationships and understandings, it means that you hear Obama say that and you're like, wait a second, but what's up with those white folks? Well, what's actually happening there? And then that opens a door for the deeper kinds of questions that we'll talk about today. So I love that as a starting point and as a way of journeying to the questions that you ask. And I think it's an important thing to model for younger social scientists, that it's okay for who you are to be a part of the motivation for the questions you ask. What do our listeners need to know to really get this and to understand why racial sympathy matters?
Totally. And I think that picks up on Neil's comment. As a multiracial person, hearing Obama kind of even have that throwaway line about some white folks, your antennas are up kind of in a different way compared to someone who doesn't think about identity. And I will say, growing up, there weren't as many multiracial people around. That's changed now. And so actually it was very validating for me in college to experience scholarship that recognized that racial identity was something a lot of people thought about, had value. And so seeing journals or, we didn't have podcasts at the time, but interviews with academics say that this was a worthy area of inquiry that deserves attention and serious and careful study was extremely legitimizing for me. So I hope that young social scientists feel that way too.
Yeah, and now more than ever, it's probably important to create
Yes.
that reinforce that message. So along those lines, let's jump into your work, which I do think is an area that's worthy of study, and that's why we wanted to talk to you about it today. Much of your work focuses on the concept of racial sympathy. So as I understand it, but I'm not the expert here on this, you are, this research examines white people's sympathy towards Black people and really tries to get at it, the causes and even some of the consequences of that. Can you tell us more, though, beyond that top line? What is racial sympathy, how and why it matters?
Yeah, so you defined it perfectly. I'll kind of situate it more broadly in it's a attitude, a pro-social attitude. So it's an attitude that conceivably could promote the welfare of other people, pro-social. We can walk around the world thinking a lot about ourselves and trying to improve things for ourselves. But when we start to think about improving things for other groups, that's maybe a different flavor of attitude. And so racial sympathy is this attitude that some white people possess where they recognize Black Americans suffering in the United States. And because a lot of our politics could address that suffering, it transfers into their political opinions about what kind of policies we ought to pursue, and in some cases, their political behavior as well. So we're talking on a kind of granular psychological level about how white people think about other groups, and this attitude of sympathy is one iteration of that. So, on the one hand, it sounds very esoteric and maybe like, given our current politics, hard to think of examples of white people possessing this attitude. But thinking about kind of the genesis of this with Obama is one way you can kind of see how this might manifest in contemporary politics. But there's other examples more recently, too. You can think about white people who are very enthusiastic to support Black Lives Matter efforts in the summer of 2020. But also there's a history, too, of, there were some white people who went down to the South to help Black voters get registered in the 60s, who protested following Rodney King verdict in Los Angeles in the 90s. So it's kind of those outcomes are what conceivably this attitude is linked with. It is a pro-social attitude with potential political consequences.
This is really interesting, Jen, as you explain this sort of attitude and how it's played out. But one of the things that I'm curious about, especially given your comment about these current times that we're living in, is the lasting power of sympathy. I know a few years ago, you and Hakeem Jefferson wrote this piece in the New York Times about the Black Lives Matter sort of movement, and after George Floyd's death and the initial spike in support and then the fading of that. Can you talk a little bit about that dynamic and how you see sympathies playing into that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, in that article, Professor Jefferson, if I may, and I talk about kind of the unique culmination of events that led to this kind of widespread white expression of support for the Black Lives Movement as really an unlikely combination of events. We had a pandemic, we had this unambiguous instance of a fatality at the hands of police officers. And so I think what that event evoked was, for sure, the white people who carried sympathy saw that event and they reacted by protesting, by donating to different organizations. But I think that event also picked up maybe attitudes that weren't sympathy, but kind of reflect that unique configuration of that time with the pandemic. So what's tricky about that is I think people saw how white people responded to that event and took that as an indication, oh, white people are generally sympathetic. And I think some white people, some white folks, to use Obama's term, are consistently and genuinely sympathetic. But that event actually revealed a non-trivial percentage of white people who don't kind of consistently carry those attitudes and were maybe more swept up in the moment. So it kind of captured both of those things.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's fair to be either totally optimistic about that, and that's kind of what the article I wrote with Professor Jefferson suggested, but I don't think that all white people's responses in that moment were shallow or kind of virtue signaling either.
Yeah. So there's two things that come to mind with this part of the conversation that's really striking me. So one is there's a really long history of white people being committed to racial justice, right? Everyone from white abolitionists during the time of enslavement to obviously some of the other examples that you've noted around the civil rights movement and in the 90s and down to 2020. So it would seem to me, just from the standpoint of history, to be unwise and sort of unreflective of what we learn from history to kind of completely write that off like, oh, it was just a thing in the moment that folks were feeling and it doesn't mean anything, right? And it would be equally unwise, I think, to over-index on that, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, like white racial sympathy is going to save us from racial injustice all by itself, right? And so I
Right.
appreciate the kind of really, I think, just discerningly balanced perspective that you offer on this piece of things. And the second thing I'd say just related to this is to the conversation that we had last month with Dorian Warren, where we talked about organizing versus mobilizing. When I think about what happened in the wake of Black Lives Matter, and specifically in the wake of the murder of George Floyd in 2020, that was really mobilizing. And I suspect, I don't know about this from a research standpoint, because if there's someone who would figure this out, it would be you, not me. But I suspect that sympathy can and likely does mobilize. Like it gets people in, it springboards them into action. But I would also expect, in the way that most mobilizing works, that would be episodic and limited. And that unless you had organizing that flowed from that, a real kind of organization and strategy and community that you brought people in to continue moving them along, continue building their power, you're almost never going to see an attitude lead to like some long lasting political involvement or power building without organizing being a kind of intermediary factor. And so sometimes I just think people put too much weight on attitudes in terms of what they expect them to do. Nobody's attitude, no matter how strong, powers them through all risk, all of life's changes and challenges, all of the changes in the political context. You need more than that. But the springboard piece, what gets people mobilized in the first place, is also very critical, right?
Totally. Yeah. No, you summarized that really well. And that aligns with, I sat down and talked with many white racially sympathetic people before the summer of 2020. And so they were expressing these commitments before this, event that captivated the world occurred. And they were, in many cases, noting they were flailing. They had nowhere to go. There was no sense of how can white people organize in a sustained and kind of institutionally supported way to advance racial justice causes. It's not something they've had to do, right? And so the attitude is there for these folks, and I have reason to believe for some of them it's truly genuine, but transforming it to sustained engagement and behavior is something that they've not been able to totally crack. And so I think that's a really very accurate diagnosis of kind of the predicament that we're all in. We have these white people who have these attitudes, but their ability to continuously convert them into behavior is basically unreliable.
Yeah. Going back to Jen and I both learned some methods from Phoebe Ellsworth, but we spent a lot of time in those classes talking about the relationship between attitudes and behavior and how do you study those things and so forth. And this is a recurring theme in that space. But I want to clarify something here because we've been talking a lot about sympathy and the good things it can produce in society, but there's a lot of discussion, especially in the past couple of years, about another concept that seems kind of related, which is racial resentment. So, you're talking a lot about racial sympathy, but there's lots of discussion about racial resentment and the role that might or might not be playing in our contemporary politics. So could you clarify, is racial sympathy basically the opposite of resentment, or is it something else entirely?
Yeah. So resentment, as you note, is a related attitude, kind of like a sibling attitude. So this is you're walking along and you're thinking about other people. For sympathy, you're thinking about other people in this sympathetic way. You feel bad for them. But for resentment, you're thinking about other people in a more pernicious way, in that you think they don't deserve some sort of outcome or benefit. And so this is an extremely potent ingredient of American politics. White people who feel resentful, primarily towards Black people, this influences the types of policies they support, the types of politicians they support. It certainly influenced their support of Barack Obama. And some of the initial studies about Obama was trying to find these white racial liberals that I study. And to do so, it looked at folks who score low on resentment. So it said, okay, if you're a white person and you don't carry these pernicious thoughts, that's the same as carrying some more positive thoughts. And there were a couple pieces of work that were published in that vein. As I read this, and, again, this is kind of drawing on my own experiences, it seemed to me that not possessing prejudice or having low levels of prejudice was not the same as necessarily possessing some more positive attitude or ascribing some more positive traits to a group. It just means the absence of prejudice, which is frankly hard to calibrate. So a lot of my book sorts this out empirically, but I think an interesting implication of this is that the white people I'm talking about, who could be very high in sympathy, very high in feeling distress over Black suffering, could also be high in racial prejudice, because I kind of conceive of these as two different attitudes. You could have a white person who carries something maybe akin to a paternalism. They feel both distressed that Black people are suffering, but then also carry some prejudicial attitudes that maybe they deserve it. And so by separating out these concepts, it kind of allows for the combination of different types of attitudes, which seems to me like what we experience in reality. When you talk to a white person, there's often many types of attitudes going on. And so to reduce it just to do they have prejudice or not is eliminating thinking about their attitudes across these different dimensions.
Yeah, I love that. And I think those distinctions are really useful. I mean, people are complex and multifaceted. And part of the challenge, part of what racism does, and it does it to everyone. It does it to people who are racialized as white, people who are racialized as Black, people who are racialized as Latino or Asian or what have you, is it flattens us. It homogenizes us. It oversimplifies us. And actually, we're all quite more complex than that.
Yes.
And so I love the complexity. Like, actually, you can hold these different kinds of attitudes at the same time. They can be in tension with each other. They can be working at cross purposes and so forth. So I think that the distinctions that this concept of racial sympathy allows us to carry are really useful and really reflective of the nature of us as people and the human condition. So thank you for clarifying that. So to my mind, one of the most fascinating things that I've come across in your work is the observation that white Americans with high levels of racial sympathy, so people who you sometimes describe as white racial justice activists, recognize the structural nature of racial inequality, right? So they know it's not just about individual prejudice and hearts and minds. They know it's a product of the ways that institutions and practices operate and the way those institutions unequally distribute advantages and disadvantages across these social classifications that we call race. But despite this knowledge, when it comes to actually doing things, to solutions, many of these same white folks that will tell you at times about the structural nature of racial inequality then focus their actions on individual level interventions, bias training, being mindful in their interpersonal interactions, and so forth. And they neglect paths that I would call more transformational around like kind of political or structural changes. This is different. It's hard to map our attitudes to our behavior. It's more so that when you map it to behavior, there's a disconnect between the level of the nature of the problem as you understand it, what level it's happening at, and the nature of the solution as you enact it. So I'm curious about what explains that disconnect and really what it means for the folks that are able to take action, that do actually do something, like what they're doing might not actually be at the scale that's necessary to address the problem. And how do we think about that?
Yeah, I thought this was a really fascinating point, and it's one that I came across when I was doing these interviews. I'm primarily a survey researcher, and I love surveys, but sometimes it's harder to get what's going on under the hood. And then I talked to these white people around Boston, and that's where I got this sense that they could kind of talk the talk. They were using words like systemic racism, structural racism, which to my mind, really point the finger at the system as the location for both the maintenance of inequality and potentially the location to address it. But then the ways they wanted to address this were very kind of almost parochial. They were individual. And so I offer some speculation as to why this is the case in the book. And, I'd be interested to hear if you have additional thoughts. But one is, they listen to Futures Forum podcasts. They learn these words. I think in the past, the white people who knew these words were taking graduate level social science courses. Now they're a little bit more in the mainstream. And so it's infiltrated the mainstream, but people have not necessarily internalized their meanings. So they can kind of roll off the tongue, but not sink in at a deeper level. So that's one possibility. Another possibility I explore in the book is they recognize this, but for whatever reason, and despite having objectively more resources than any other racial group, they feel really ineffective in their ability to bring about a change to this outcome. So we would call this the concept of efficacy. Something has gone on and you want to do something to change the outcome. And for whatever reason, the white people I talked to, who again had higher levels of education, higher levels of resources, the kind of things we typically associate with higher levels of efficacy, felt very down in the dumps about being able to do anything about it. And you can possess this deep commitment, but if you think nothing you do is going to change, you may not be compelled to do anything about it. But a third possibility, and this has been alluded to earlier, is mobilization for sustained systematic change isn't episodic or ephemeral, right? It has to be sustained and maintained through some infrastructure, organizations, leaders, visionaries who are articulating, here's how you transform this attitude into XYZ behaviors. And white people don't really have that. They haven't had to develop an apparatus to secure a different racial future for themselves in the way that other communities of color have had to. And so they are lacking that. So I think, it's all those things. And I will say, too, this sense of taking a huge social problem and acting on it in this very individual, atomistic way is not necessarily exclusive to race, though that's obviously the domain I study. But a lot of the work I read that informed this came from work about environmentalism, which
Exactly.
I know Neil is familiar with. You have people who believe climate change is happening, who are bracing for, a historic heat wave. And their solution is to bring a reusable tote bag to the grocery store and
ride your bike to work.
A hybrid car. And it's a similar kind of, these aren't climate change deniers or anything. Like they think it's a problem, but their way of acting on it is ultimately kind of missing the mark if you think about just the scale of these problems. So I think it is maybe part of a broader iteration of how we take in big social problems and try to behave in response to them.
I agree that it's endemic. And Neil and I both also study health, and I feel like you see this in health, right?
Yeah.
We talk about all the structural conditions that lead to the structural and social determinants of health and that lead to health outcomes and disparities. And then it's like, exercise more. And,
yes.
And eat healthy. And look, you should exercise and eat healthy, dear listener. Take care of yourself. But it turns out that is not going to address the fundamental problems here.
Right.
I'm glad you raised all these points and connected them to so many different domains, because I do think this is a bigger issue for us to think through. In the work on structural racism, for instance, this is something that we talk about a lot, and Jamila and I have some ongoing research about this, that to your point, these terms have entered the mainstream, especially over the past 5-6 years. There's been so much coverage about it that people know these words. Do they know what they actually mean at a fundamental day-to-day level? Not really.
Right.
And this is one of the things we've been studying is some of the frustration that actually comes with that people have a sense that this is a thing I'm supposed to know, but what do I do with that information? There's frustration around that. Your book finds that. Some of the interviews we're doing in some other contexts, that's coming up as well. There's seeing the destination, but not the path to get there.
Right.
And so that's something I think we fundamentally need to figure out in work moving forward, not just in this space of racial justice as we're talking about, but as you pointed out, it's the big problem in climate change communication. It's the big problem in health. It just keeps popping up everywhere. So like, thanks for raising that.
Yeah. And I think part of like even creating opportunities for conversations and discourse like this is to start trying to map out the path, envision the path, help people to understand how's organizing different than mobilizing? Like, how might your actions align with the scope of the problem as you understand it? And some of these conversations, if you haven't even been exposed to them, then you definitely aren't going to be able to think through that. So I think even this is a part of that larger effort to create an opportunity for folks to move in some different ways.
Yeah, I think that'd be great. I mean, I think one takeaway from the book is the sympathy, if I've measured it carefully and thought about it correctly, it's there. So efforts to kind of make white people more sympathetic or give them more knowledge, it's not. The crux of the issue is how to kind of translate this reservoir that's there among not all white people, right? The title of the book is Some White Folks, among some white people into observable and impactful action beyond just reading a book on your couch.
And connecting again to the climate point you raised a second ago, there's a similar kind of theme there. I remember like for so long, so much of at least the environmental psych work was focused on getting people to believe in climate change, right?
Right.
It's like, wrote a paper about, almost 10 years ago now, that was irritating to some people because it pointed out that just getting people to believe in climate change isn't enough to get them to do the things that are necessary.
Right.
So
turns out that doesn't change anything in the world, but it's a step in the process.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to step back a little bit more and think big picture. And I want to ask you a question that maybe seems like a tough question, but I really want to say that it's coming from a place of really good faith. But also, I keep it real. So it was on my mind. So I was like, let me ask it. Why focus so much on white people's attitudes, right? In some ways, one could say this is centering the perspectives and thinking of the dominant social group that maybe we already center a lot.
Yep.
And similarly, like black-white relations, or we could think about the kind of spectrum of possibilities in terms of different groups that are racialized and that have to be and live and act together in society as much wider than that. And so I'm just curious about that choice. And I don't think in any way that calls into question the importance of your work, to be clear. But I want our listeners to have a sense of what is at stake and why these specific dynamics that you engage are worth considering so closely. And I'm thinking about the listener out there that can be like me. And I remember really early on in graduate school going through my kind of standard American politics survey course and like kind of feeling a little exacerbated, like, man, racial attitudes work in political science is all about what white people think,
Yeah.
And being in an institution where I had advisors that were like, yeah, well, we can study some other things. That can be a default for me. One of the things I appreciate about actually reading your work is that I'm like, wait, this is really important. And I want to bring that to our listener and make sure they can understand that too, even if they might have the same cynical default as me.
I really appreciate that. And, to be transparent, I started grad school hoping that I could study Obama as a fellow multiracial person and think about how multiracial people might support him. And, you can ask Vince Hutchings, that was what my application was about. And one thing we all know is studying non-white groups is logistically very challenging. And it's something I am excited to do now that I have the security and relief of tenure. But I was fascinated by white people, in part because, they still control many of the outcomes that we experience, especially in mainstream politics. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say they are the dominant group numerically. And certainly if we look at our representation, they are very well represented. And so understanding their attitudes and opinions can help us understand why certain outcomes transpire, why they're sustained, because if white people like them, then in many cases, they will continue on because politics is a venue where they're able to often realize their attitudes and preferences. And so, that's, I think, why it's interesting for me to study white people. Generally, for sympathy in particular, I think it's interesting because if we have a future of multiracial democracy, which, fingers crossed.
Yeah.
This work maybe provides us some insight as to the white people who are in favor of moving in that direction. And we know not all white people are. Many white people are very protective of maintaining their higher status. But assuming, demographics shift in the way that they're projected to, this work kind of gives us insight about who are the white folks, what are kind of the orientations of those who want to come along with the shift, who are kind of in support of building this multiracial democracy. And so I think, how far are they willing to go? That's a very open question. Not many groups are willingly eager to give up their status and their power and their resources. And I'm not saying that the some white folks I study are signed up for all of those things, but kind of what are the boundaries of this support? How far are they willing to go? What is the content of it? I think those are interesting questions. And as for why study Black, white in particular, I think, as a political scientist, that's really where many of our politics have been born out of, that interracial relation. And think about the history of so many of the public policies that I study in the book, that we tend to talk about with respect to domestic politics in your own work, Jamila and Neil, like the Black-white interracial relation is really fundamental for getting your head around that. I do think, actually, I know some other scholars have tried to study sympathy between non-white groups, relationships between non-white groups. I think that's so important. But I also think there's ingredients there that may not just be how this is playing out, because non-white groups have experienced, although different histories and different trajectories, some of them have experienced a shared experience of discrimination. And so I think that's an element that makes studying this dynamic among non-white groups potentially psychologically different. So I'm not able to accomplish that in this book, but I focus on the Black-white interracial relationship because it's so fundamental to American politics. And I think these could be some white people who could be engaged in efforts to advance causes for other non-white groups as we move forward as a country.
Are you telling me you're not able to study every single topic? I'm astonished. No. I think that makes so much sense. And I fundamentally see it as, when I hear what you're saying, I keep thinking about power. And, whether intentional or not, when we look at the basic structural contours of American politics, white Americans have power. And so understanding what they think, what they want, and how they might wield that power, and thinking of them not as a monolith, but as a complex, multifaceted, racialized group is really important. I think your work helps us to do that. So, yeah.
I have a related follow-up, though, based on something you were just saying in response to Jamila and just a broader conversation in society. To get into it, it might be helpful to first sort of think back to the 2024 presidential election. We can consider this the Kamala question. So, when Vice President Harris was running for president, everyone, it seems, had something to say about her identities as a Black candidate, an Asian candidate, and of course, as a woman. Because she was all of those things, she didn't fit neatly into any one box. And that led to, of course, think piece after think piece about who she really is, what she stands for, and whether different subgroups should support her. So I guess my question is, what does your work on racial sympathy tell us about not necessarily her, but how we might expect people to respond to candidates like that moving forward, candidates that don't fit neatly into these boxes that society has. So you started talking about that a little bit. I'd love to hear more because, as you said, so much of the literature centers on clear Black-white relations, and this is becoming more complex as demographics change. And so, what might we expect moving forward?
I love that question. Obviously maps onto my own experiences as someone with multiple identities. So I think about it in a few ways. One way I think about it is, if you want to geek out on measurement, this is kind of a reason why when I structured my measure, which is these little stories, I thought it was really important to write 4 stories about different types of Black people, men, women, individuals, and groups, because it'd be interesting to see if white people's sympathy kind of mapped on in different ways depending on the level or the type of person who was perceived to be suffering. And so I think, your question hits on, is there some sort of, how generalizable is this racial sympathy, or are there kind of iterations depending on the identity? So when she was being attacked on the basis of her Blackness, I think certainly the racial sympathy that I measure in the vignettes is relevant there. And, that occurred, for example, I believe Trump said something like, "Is she even Black?"
I remember that.
So like that identity in particular had been picked out at certain points of the campaign. But I think there's an interesting question here, and this is to Jamila's earlier point about one thing prejudice does is it flattens all these different component identities, right? And so it may not be surprising that despite carrying these multiple identities, some research has shown that to the prejudiced white person, Kamala Harris was Black above,
anything else,
these different things. And so it's a question, if you have a prejudiced white person, but they also carry some sympathy, are they seeing a more complex person, or is there similar kind of reduction? I didn't study her in this way, so I don't know, but I'd be curious to see if there was, a similar trait, that kind of pops out for sympathetic white people, and what that means, because I think she was actually tried to be very intentional for whatever reason about presenting herself in this way, and yet still it's reductive in this way that kind of just emphasizes her racial identity alone, her Black racial identity alone.
Yeah, it was really interesting to your point, like the intentional broad representation versus how it was received. And that was also making me think about potential future directions about racial sympathy and social categorization and how people process all of that.
There's so much there. And it just makes me think about the disservice that racism does to all of us who are living together in this society by flattening us in the ways that it does. And you don't get to be all of the different parts of you in the eyes of some people. You're just Black, right? And not to say that Black there's no just before it, right? Like it's like a part of all the different parts of who we are like matter to us, right? But the just can be, that's the flattening that we don't want, right? And so thinking about the implications of that, it doesn't just matter on an interpersonal level, on a social group level. That actually has implications for how we understand political candidates or leaders, and for how we live and govern ourselves in relation to each other. And so that's just the different threads, potential threads there are many. To take us down the home stretch of this conversation, we could, of course, keep talking to you for who knows how long, Jen, but we want to be kind to our listeners and actually end our conversation at some point. But I want to take us there by posing a question that I think is one that lies at the heart of all the work we do here at the Center for Racial Justice and Equitable Futures. And it's relatively straightforward, but not. And that question is, what are the implications of the politics of racial sympathy for racial justice? And in particular, I'm wondering whether you view white racial sympathy as a prerequisite or a necessity for moving forward towards racial justice. Do we need it? And what the possibilities are there, and also what the limits are of white racial sympathy, particularly when it comes to building a just and equitable futures. And I'm thinking about what you mentioned at this conversation, multiracial democracy, and what we've mentioned in other conversations on the podcast. If we think of multiracial democracy as one of our North Stars, the destination that many of us would like to reach, a kind of democratic polity marked by freedom and equality, but also one where all of us can live, right, together in ways that are peaceful and in ways that are equitable, and ways that create space for us to thrive in all our different ways we're positioned with respect to racial identities or classifications. When we think out at that aspirational, I will admit, horizon, where does racial sympathy fit in terms of getting us there?
Okay, so
it's a lot.
I will start off by quoting Vince Hutchings, which is that I don't have a crystal ball. So I can't, this is speculative. I would not say white racial sympathy is necessary, but I would say it would be so helpful if the group with the most resources, the most political power, the most stature in our current politics moved and felt compelled to participate in this multiracial democracy experiment we have going on here. Because of their immense power and resources and stature, their support in such an endeavor could, here's the crystal ball, be really consequential in helping this country kind of realize its form as a multiracial democracy. If I look at who's in office right now, if I look at who runs for office, who's at the top of every domain of American social life, it's hard to see anything but white faces. And a lot of those faces are not sympathetic to having things change and have it maybe in their interest to keep their position intact. And so if they're co-ethnics, if fellow white people, if they're, some white folks could articulate and move towards and truly believe in a future in which those experiences were open to people of other races, I think that would be potentially really transformative. So I think there is a really significant role these people could play. I don't know if it's necessary. I don't have the crystal ball. It's possible that this future could be realized without the participation of some white people. But I think if some white folks were not only willing, but kind of enthusiastic participants in this endeavor, it might happen in a more kind of widespread and enduring way. So that's what I think.
Yeah.
And this is where I wish I was a comparativist to see around the world. It's replicated around the world. We have places where groups that are in power have sought to elevate others and other times when they haven't. And I think that dynamic will have to happen in the United States. We'll have to reckon with that at some point in the near future.
Well, you have given us plenty, and comparativists, they don't have the crystal ball either.
Okay, good.
But I think given the lack of availability of a crystal ball, you've offered us so much to think about and such generative insights and a really good note to end on, right? And I think it speaks to the fact that we actually all need each other, right? And this idea that like racial justice is just about Black people and it's just about making life better for Black people or for fill in the blank one group of people. Actually, it's about how we live and how we are and how we thrive together. And there's space for everyone in doing the work of making that possible. That's something that I really like about your work. It's that it's thinking about the space for some white folks in making a real multiracial democracy and an equitable future possible. And that's important. So thank you for sharing your ideas and your work with us, but also yourself, Jen. You've brought so much to the conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed talking about my book with you.
Yeah. Get the book, listeners. Yes.
You have been listening to the Futures Forum podcast, a production of the Center for Racial Justice and Equitable Futures at Cornell University. Find us online at equitablefutures.cornell.edu.